Hi, I'm Jared from KTWU. Coming up, a segment from Sunflower Journeys. If you enjoy it, please consider visiting ktwu.org to make a contribution.
First, we step back to 1961 as Jim Kelly takes a look at Centennial celebrations of Kansas statehood.
Kansas was feeling pretty good about itself by 1961. There had been a few bumps in the economy and in the weather in the 1950s, but Kansas was high on itself in 1961. Dwight D. Eisenhower was just out of the presidency, you know, in January of '61. William Inge had been the king on Broadway for a long time. We'd been depicted in Hollywood westerns as you know, the place where the West all happened. And so Kansas felt good about itself, and 100 years of survival, yeah, everybody was pretty high on Kansas in 1961.
A year of celebration began in January of 1961. The state of Kansas was 100 years old, and it's interesting to look at how and what Kansans chose to celebrate. Of course, there were the usual activities that one would expect: speeches, ceremonies, banquets, and official proclamations. There was a Santa Fe Trail wagon train that crossed the state, passing through various communities along the way. The Stars of Gunsmoke paid a visit to Dodge City, and a time capsule containing all sorts of memorabilia was placed in the State House rotunda.
The Centennial Commission, as it was called, was in charge. They had a fleet of cars. They did parades all over. They did reenactments of Civil War battles. They went to different sites in Kansas and put on events there, beard growing contests. A lot of my friends' fathers were trying to grow beards.
On the national level, Kansas had a Centennial float in the Orange Bowl Parade, and in Philadelphia, there was a reenactment of Lincoln raising the newest American flag with 34 stars. But without a doubt, the biggest Centennial event in 1961 was the production of The Kansas Story. The Kansas Story was a historical pageant, a huge extravaganza that depicted the history of Kansas, beginning with the Spanish in Coronado and continuing on through the first 100 years of statehood. Performed in both Topeka and Wichita, the Kansas Story brought together local and national talent under the guidance of Hollywood writer-director Valdemar Rosing. One of the local participants was Dale Easton, a longtime actor, director, and playwright in Northeast Kansas.
The speaking was done off stage in a trailer with a bunch of professional actors they brought up from California. But local people with theater experience were used on stage, and you were far enough from the people that they would come on, pretend to be speaking, you know, moving their arms and stuff, and then over the speaker, you would hear these voices, and it all tied in together, and it sounded like people were talking.
In addition to the local actors, hundreds of extras with no theater experience were needed for the lavish production that spread across 7 stages.
It was a chance to be a part of the state Centennial, and we had gobs of untrained people who were marvelous because Val could just whip them into shape, and they came from the whole part of the state, came from Lawrence and places like that, and drove down, and it was the biggest thing that ever happened to them, you know.
The Kansas Story featured musical numbers by composer Meredith Willson and showcased the talents of nationally known singer Lucille Norman and members of the Chicago Opera Ballet. The Kansas Story was more than just a pageant. It was a spectacle.
Over a cast of 1,000. There were 7 different stages. There were lights shining down on it all. It was almost like sort of watching parades go across different stages. Here go the cowboys, and then here go the Conestoga wagons with their pioneers. Here go the conquistadors in their Spanish garb. And I remember thinking it was great.
Kansas had seen more than its share of turmoil during its territorial period and the first 100 years of statehood. But those themes were generally ignored in 1961.
It's like celebrating any anniversary or celebrating a wedding anniversary. I mean, you just want to go with the fact that you have a marriage, you have an anniversary, you've survived. You know there's been ups and downs, but this is not the time to talk about it at the party. Historians had always been conscious and self-conscious about America and about Kansas. And Emery Lindquist in the Kansas Historical Quarterly wrote a centennial portrait of Kansas. And he talks about some of the bumps along the way. He talks about the rough edges of Kansas. He talks about the fact that the contradictions in Kansas, the fact that we were a free state, anti-slavery place, born before the Civil War and all that turmoil, and then wrote blacks out of the Constitution of 1859, needed to have a Supreme Court decision to desegregate our schools in 1954. He points out those kinds of contradictions. So I think historians are always a little more aware of looking at the whole picture than the ordinary Kansan who wants to grow a beard and be part of a big celebration.
A great deal has happened to our state and to our country since 1961. And as Kansas approaches its 150th anniversary in 2011, it will once again be interesting to see how and what we choose to celebrate.
I think almost all celebrations ever since the bicentennial of the United States in 1976 have probably changed in their character, in the nature of them. I think if you look at the years between 1961 and 1976, it's a very short period of time, 15 years. But you see the impeachment or near impeachment of the resignation of Richard Nixon as president. You see the tragedy of the Vietnam War. No matter what side you were on, it wasn't a good time. You see the assassinations of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. You see all of the race riots, and you see a big awareness in the country that we don't have an American story. We have lots of American stories, and we need to talk about them all. My guess is that that is what will happen at the sesquicentennial in 2011. It will be not a big pageant that's called The Kansas Story, but there'll probably be a lot of small events, exhibits, photographic displays, things like that that tell Kansas stories, a lot of Kansas stories.
Glad you could stop by to see a clip from Sunflower Journeys. There are more great local stories out there waiting to be discovered, but it takes help from viewers like you and me to make it happen. Visit KTWU.org right now to make a pledge.